Dear Professor Tooze, dear Dr. Kang, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the University of Zurich and our Aula Magna. We are honored to host this year's State of Asia address once again. My heartfelt thanks go to the Asia Society Switzerland and our own Global Affairs team for their initiative and efforts to make tonight a big success. As Nico mentioned, the University of Zurich is a founding member of Asia Society Switzerland, sharing a strong commitment to building competence and keeping Switzerland connected to the world. In times of uncertainty and what Adam Tooze has described as the age of polycrisis, it is more crucial than ever to maintain these global ties and continue fostering understanding and analysis. With Donald Trump winning the presidential election in the United States, the uncertainties in the geopolitical landscape will increase. His America First policy will most probably lead to tensions with its trade partners as well as with the partners within the NATO Defense Alliance. To further contextualize the shifting global landscape, I'd like to introduce a recent contribution to this discussion by former Australian Prime Minister and former President of Asia Society, Kevin Rudd, in his new book on Xi Jinping. This work describes the ideological worldview of driving China's domestic and international behavior. Shaped largely by President Xi Jinping, his unique blend of Marxist-Leninist nationalism. According to Rudd, Xi's vision has shifted China's political and economic policies decisively leftward, intensifying a national and nationalistic agenda which results in a more assertive foreign policy and aims at reshaping the international status quo. Ironically, this is a position that is taken by the right wing in the West. At the University of Zurich, we recognize the importance of analyzing and discussing these global shifts. Our extensive partnerships across Asia, our academic programs, and the international makeup of our student and faculty body reflect our commitment to this understanding. We are proud of our strategic partnership with the University of Kyoto and our active role in a global network that links us with leading universities from the region, including China, Indonesia, India, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and soon to be concluded, Vietnam. And we currently host almost 1,400 students from Asia, about 1/4 of all foreign students at the University of Zurich, as well as more than 180 staff members from the region. We are happy to support Asia Society Switzerland's work of fostering Asia competence and have collaborated on a wide range of issues over the last couple of years. Members of the University of Zurich regularly share their research with the Asia Society Network. Last year, for example, University of Zurich's Professor Simona Grano was the inaugural Toy Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Switzerland. We also benefit from insights from the conversations that Asia Society is hosting, such as tonight. I look forward to the address and to ensuing conversations. We are especially pleased to welcome Dr. Kyung-wha Kang, Asia Society's Global President and CEO, who brings unparalleled insights from her distinguished career, including her service as South Korea's first female Minister of Foreign Affairs and her work with the United Nations. Following a brief video presentation, Dr. Kang will share her perspectives with us. Thank you all for joining today, and we look forward to an insightful event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Schwarzenegger, Professor Tooze, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you to the State of Asia Address, which provides the starting point for tomorrow's State of Asia Conference, hosted by Asia Society Switzerland. Since becoming president of Asia Society 7 months ago, I have visited many of our 16 locations around the world, including Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, my country, South Korea, and yesterday I arrived from Paris, the location of one of our newest centers. Asia Society is a unique organization. As you've seen the video, it was founded in 1956 by John D. Rockefeller III to bring Asia closer to America at the time. And today, 7 decades later, that mission is now global, to bring Asia closer to wherever Asia Society works. And across our locations, we generate analysis and share expertise on geopolitics and policy, provide a platform for inclusive dialogue, empower young leaders, and celebrate Asian art and culture. These are all geared towards fulfilling our core mission of building bridges and deepening mutual understanding and appreciation with the countries and peoples of Asia, because we believe this is the road to greater peace and prosperity. Developing this Asia competence has become ever more pressing and important today, when geopolitical tensions and technological competition are rising in and around Asia, and fragmented information environments makes it very hard for people to understand each other within and across national borders. Asia competence is crucial for Switzerland too. During my time at the UN, I spent several years in Geneva and developed a deep appreciation for this country. Switzerland has many important roles to play as an active and engaged member of the international community and as a platform for dialogue. And doing so requires an understanding and engagement with Asia more deeply. I'm very grateful to the team and board of Asia Society Switzerland, who have been doing this important work for 9 years now. And as the first center in Europe, they have played an important role in expanding the reach of Asia Society. And tonight's packed room and tomorrow's sold-out State of Asia conference are a testament to the relevance and quality of the team's work here. It is indeed a privilege to be in this historic lecture hall today. My very sincere thanks to the University of Zurich and Professor Christian Schwarzenegger for hosting us here today and for the partnership and support you have provided us with. I'm told this is the room where Winston Churchill gave his very famous speech in 1946, asking to let Europe arise. Well, today, it is undoubtedly Asia that is rising and will keep rising as the 21st century's center of gravity in global affairs, whether it's economics or geopolitics. Of course, Asia is also very huge, diverse, and complex, and multifaceted region, and delivering an assessment of the state of Asia, as tonight's address promises, is a very daunting task. But luckily for us, Professor Adam Tooze delights in a daunting task, like analyzing the great financial crises and the global response to the COVID pandemic, as he did in his best-selling books, Crashed and Shut Down. Adam holds the Catherine Shelby Cullum Davis Chair of History at Columbia University in New York and serves as director of the European Institute there. In 2019, Foreign Policy named him one of the top global thinkers of the decade. He writes Chartbook, a newsletter on economics, geopolitics, and history. And he is also a contributing editor for the Financial Times and a columnist for Foreign Policy that also publishes his podcast, Ones and Twos. And after Adam's address, Asia Society Switzerland's executive director, Nico Luxinger, will host a conversation with him, and you will also have the ability to submit questions. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Adam Tooze to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a delight and a pleasure and honor to be here. Many thanks to Professor Schwarzenegger, Dr. Kang, to Nico Leuchinger and the entire team at Asia Society. Watching the video, I realized I feel I'm part of some sort of Asia Society network, because up there was Vishaka Desai, featured very prominently, who recently recruited me to my latest job role at Columbia, which is chairing the Committee of Global Thought, which is a strong analog to the kind of work that the Asia Society does here. So I look forward to partnership at many different levels, both in Europe and in New York. It's been said that I like a challenge. Can we have the slides up here, please? Are we gonna get the, we're well ahead. It is true that I like a challenge, but on the other hand, spare a thought for the author of today's talk at the weekend, an English guy with a strong German and European attachment sitting in New York, composing a lecture on Asia in the age of polycrisis for an audience in Switzerland to be given the day after a decisive American election that in large part has been taking place under the sign of the China shock, scheduled thanks to the great cooperation of Zurich University and the miracle of Zoom to give a lecture later this evening to my traumatized American students on the fall of the Weimar Republic. So I count 8 levels of determination here that characterize my moment this evening. And in German, you would say, es besteht Gesprächsbedarf. We need to have a chat. There's things we need to talk about. And one of the things it seems to me we can't escape talking about this evening is the different way in which all of those kaleidoscopic facets of all of those 8 things, in a sense, intersect with each other. Not to assume some common standpoint when it doesn't exist, but to think in a kaleidoscopic fashion, or maybe it's something more complicated like that. One of those machines at an optician's where they keep changing the slides on you about the way in which this looks. Because I don't think the drama of the US election looks the same in Europe and Asia. I don't even think it looks the same as in Zurich as it does in Berlin, where I'm going later this week. I think it's highly specific depending on where you're at, this shifting pattern of history. And that's really going to be my theme, both as an outsider to Asia and also in my amateurish efforts to scan that incredible kaleidoscope, which is summarized in this rubric. I mean, one simple way of thinking about it, especially from a Berlin point of view, allow me just to adopt that, which I know is different from Zurich, is that, the Trump election matters dramatically for Europe, as seen from Berlin, because he's already called them out once already. Right? The clashes between Trump and Angela Merkel were legendary. It doesn't even bear thinking about what an encounter between Olaf Scholz and Donald Trump might look like, to be honest. There is a personality element to that. There is also a structural determination in that the security of Western Europe has depended since the beginning, since Winston Churchill uttered those words. Because he wasn't just asking for Europe to arise, he was asking for an entire configuration of power to arise at the end of World War II. Europe has crucially and structurally depended on America for its security. And thirdly, speaking specifically, and this is where I think 2 German-speaking countries like this part of Switzerland and Germany differ fundamentally, for Germany, at least, the question of American democracy is a question of identity. Because they don't have the sort of democratic myth that Switzerland does to draw on to define what it means to be a modern democratic Germany, separate from their relationship to the United States. And you might say Weimar Republic, even the Weimar Republic was crucially dependent on the United States, which is what I'm going to be telling my students about later this evening. So that's a 3-way determination of that relationship that makes it very special. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for Western Europe, specifically Berlin, Trump is the polycrisis. He personifies it. He is the expression of the compacting together. This idea of polycrisis is the sum of the parts is worse than the individual elements that are added up. And you can see what I'm getting at with Trump, right? The populism, the ambivalence on NATO, the climate deniable, the disinhibited personality, you add it all up and you have the perfect storm that somebody like Trump represents for the Bonn Republic, would have represented for the Bonn Republic, does for Berlin today. And I simply don't think that's true in the same way for the vast majority of this complex structure that we call Asia. People may want to differ and suggest counterexamples. Maybe this plays out somewhat differently. Taiwan, maybe. South Korea might be the closest. There's a very strong skein of South Korean scholarship on German history, and I've always thought it might be to do with these structural parallels. But if you look more generally, it seems to me Asia's position on the American election is more relaxed. Essentially, geopolitics in Asia right now is certainly tense, but it's not tense in the conditional way that, say, Europe's position on Ukraine is conditional on the outcome of this election. Russia's further away, and in the case of both India and China, it's friendly. I was thinking another instance would be India's in the sweet spot of being wanted by both sides. So, and the pivot on the American side towards India is bipartisan, and it started under Bush in the early 2000s. If you're Vietnam, I think it's also true that both sides are playing for you, so you can feel fairly relaxed about where you stand. You're going to have to play hard, but they both want you. China, I think, shrugs because it knows, basically, that it's America's antagonist one way or the other, and the hard pivot was initiated under Clinton and has been continued with real vigor under Biden, and it's very unclear how much difference it ultimately makes. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And if you think more generally, we don't have an Asian equivalent to NATO, as hard as the Biden team has tried to turn the Quad, or what they call the lattice work of alliances, into something analogous. Those structures aren't there. So the showdown that we're undoubtedly going to be treated to next spring in the first NATO conference that Trump attends, let's hope to goodness he hasn't seen the scurrilous reportage on his first round that appeared in the Financial Times. There is no obvious equivalent to that in the Asian case. US trade policy is clearly, I think, the area where Europe and Asia share the same neuralgic sense of, whoa, this could get really serious. But again, the positioning is fundamentally different. I mean, the shock that drives a large part of American discourse right now is the China shock. And to be honest, we ain't seen nothing yet, because the first China shock was when China was incorporating into our supply chains. The second China shock is when we begged to be incorporated into theirs. If you think about electric vehicles, that's the test right now. I've heard very senior German figures say, we need to be talking about joint ventures, and this time round we're going to steal from them rather than the other way around. Right? That's a profound shock. And this graph, which is not GDP or industry, it's a really interesting graph, and it's more dramatic than most you see, is manufacturing. So this is the bit that folks care about most dramatically. And China isn't catching up with the West, or close to. There's no debatable point. China entirely dominates the global manufacturing ecosystem in the large at this point. You can make specific individual exemptions. You know, highly sophisticated aircraft, for instance, they're not yet really at the races there. But if you look at the whole thing, it's a very different story. Secondly, whatever happens in US trade with its partners in the world, for more than a decade, in fact 2 decades now, it's really Asia on Asia trade that's been the driver of globalization. Certainly in the last 10 years, Asia on Asia trade has been the great dynamo. And the effect of America withdrawing into a more isolationist position is really just handing more of the game to Asia on Asia trade, because that's where the demand's going to be. Will there be spillover effects? Can you tell a story about how high American protectionism will produce massive Chinese pressure in new markets? Yes, you can, but I think that's a second-order effect. It's a margin on a margin. Protectionism in general is a marginal logic in the development of world economies, and displacement effects produced by protectionism are margins on margins. The big story of global growth in trade is Asian-centered anyway, and to the extent that America withdraws from that, it becomes even more dynamic. And if you get into the zone of industrial policy, and we think today of the current era as one of being industrial policy, in a funny kind of way, the American effort under Joe Biden to find ways of substituting for China only, of course, resulted in greater dependence on other Asian players. So American industrial policy on 5G was European, because it depended on Erica and Nokia to replace Huawei. And American industrial policy on chips is, well, it's Intel, but also Intel is a dead man walking. And listen to me here, because the last time I spoke in this aula, I said just 1 or 2 words, Credit Suisse, several times over and over again. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. In this case, if America is going to do microelectronic industrial policy, it's actually relying on Taiwanese and South Korean players to do the work for it. So even if America turns towards a more national strategy, it's not self-sufficient, right? It's actually dependent on a supply chain that's centered in Asia. So for all of these reasons, sure, American protectionism is disruptive, but I would again submit that doesn't catch Asia in the same position of weakness, and so if I keep coming back to my German friends, as it catches the German auto industry in the current moment. Asia is on the front foot in key areas of global manufacturing. And so the question, as much as anything, is not what impact will this have on Asia, is can we do without Asia, is the central question animating American, and I think in the end, serious European policy discussion as well. So I think the geopolitical scene is very different. I think the industrial policy and trade scene is very different. I think the most vivid instance, though, in fact, is culture, and it's a matter of identity. Because as we all know, Trump actually got along famously with Abe in Japan, Duterte in the Philippines, Modi in India. If you want to find people who are seriously relaxed about the current situation, talk to Indian correspondents. It's really remarkable. And Xi, and of course Putin at MBS too. And if you kind of read this with an Asia society hat on, I think one of the things that you might be tempted to say is that the prevalent liberal discourse that characterizes Trump as an autocrat versus democracy has about it, if we put our cultural historians' hats on, a kind of familiar chain which takes you from Western democracy to Eastern Oriental autocracy. I think the scandal for many European and American liberals is that Trump is too, quote unquote, Oriental for their taste. There's a sense in which the American president doesn't quite fit in our system. He doesn't like constitutions, which in the American case is this kind of horror. And I think in this, of course, I'm peddling in Orientalist tropes here. I'm not saying this is a sensible characterization of Trump, but I think in the extraordinary sense of outrage and indignation that American liberals affect in relation to him, there is a fear of touching something else. There's a fearing and disgust with regard to something else. So whereas for Europe, Trump personifies polycrisis, you could say that the relative equanimity of Asia in the face of the US election suggests how much more self-confidently Asia in general, and Dr. Kang said this, is rising and knows it. And there is a sense that Trump is a symptom, lots of people like the Gramsci quote, he's a morbid symptom of an interregnum, and the future to come will be something different, and in that space, morbid symptoms, some people even translate this as monsters arise, and in the liberal or leftist imagination, Trump then figures as that monster of the interregnum. Now, and you can go one step even further than that, and you can begin to ask yourself whether this polycrisis talk is in fact really a storm in the Western bottle. Is this really just, or the storm rather in the Western teacup? Is this sense of some sort of drama that we need to confront, is that not really in some senses being cooked up, I don't know, between Brussels and Berlin? The idea itself was given currency by Jean-Claude Juncker in the 2014-2015 period. And it's me, it's folks like myself, it's Martin Wolf, it's Larry Summers talking, believe it or not, about my writing about polycrisis, turtles all the way down, flattering on the one hand and terrifying on the other, because surely, seriously, there's supposed to be somebody else who's providing the concepts in this period. Like, is this basically a collective Western freakout? I mean, are we basically losing our minds over the phenomenon of Asia rising? And that's what I want to struggle with a little bit. Because you could, if you went down this line, you could build a big contrast between the diminished self-confidence of folks like ourselves and the panic that we feel. When Larry Summers says something like, Ich finde die Situation unübersichtlich. I simply can't find a concept that grasps this, you know we're in trouble. Because Larry Summers is not a man to easily admit that he's lost the grip of the situation. And it contrasts, of course, incredibly starkly with you have to say in German, you describe this as a Biedermeier scene, like the 21st century Marxism offered to us on a beautiful antique bookcase that's offering us a future of the world, or the slightly more brash version that we got during the extraordinary G20 meeting, in which the BJP welcomed the other leaders of the democratic, indeed the rest of the world, with this. You can't only just say it, but it basically says the most popular politician in the world is Modi. As we know, the elections then demonstrated the complexity and power of the Indian electorate to develop a rather different answer. But nevertheless, this is that sense of Asia rising, if only they can get it right. And their answer is growth. I mean, to somebody who has a kind of thing for 1950s and 1960s modernism, there's something rather glorious about these AI-generated visions of the India of the future or the Indonesian new capital that we've sketched out in the jungle. There's a sort of extraordinary drama here, the revival of old fantasies of modernity in all of their rich promise, but also, of course, complexity, as thinkers from the Chinese New Left onwards pointed out to us. And speaking with a historian's hat on, there is, of course, something extraordinarily striking about the contrast between this moment, in which Asia presents to us the face of modernity against our shattered self-confidence in the West, and the moment in the early 1970s when I would argue that the idea of polycrisis first began to circulate. And the document I'm thinking of is the Club of Rome report of 1972, which drew arguably the first non-Marxist, thoroughly bourgeois social science idea of a multifarious, multifaceted, comprehensive crisis, starting with resource constraints, overpopulation, escalating prices, and economic slowdown. This was our sense of polycrisis encapsulated in the early 1970s. It went hand in hand, of course, then with war, with the 73 Arab-Israeli war, with the oil shock, and a sense of, as it were, the world coming apart. But it was formulated by the Club of Rome, and it was about the world. And what's really striking is the extraordinarily different position that Asia occupied in that vision of global crisis then as opposed to where it is now. Because if you look in the Club of Rome report, they are extrapolating a future on the basis of the 1960s. And if you did that, your future looked like this. I mean, it really is worth taking ourselves back. This is the sort of thing historians do. If you project out the 1960s, which is the famous Hindu rate of growth in India, the period of massive upheaval in China, and you project from there the future, it looks profoundly bleak for the majority of humanity who then as now are Asian, right? South Korea was then emerging. I mean, Dr. Kang's country is surely the most staggering example of this. 1950s South Korea is a place of absolute immiseration and ruin. It is arguably the poorest place, one of the very poorest, top 5 poorest places on the planet in the late 1950s as a result of the war and the lack of industrialization, rocketing into a different future already in the 60s. But a really problematic Asia. I've been thinking, as many people in the room may have recently, quite a lot about Bangladesh. And think about the image of Bangladesh in the early 1970s. Right? These are the extraordinary photographs recently discovered by the Indian photographer Raghu Rai, who took these on the Indian-Bangladeshi, what will become the Bangladeshi border, in December 1971, when it was still East Pakistan. And he is capturing a savage reality of immiseration. Right? This is the image of stark poverty. And it's an Asian polycrisis at that moment, right? That's where the population constraint, where immiseration is really going to bind. Compare and contrast that to the very latest report by the World Bank on the problem of global poverty, which actually explicitly picks up the polycrisis term, and we're in a different world altogether. So this is poverty measured at 2 different thresholds, and the $2.15 one is the absolute lowest level. And you might as well have entitled this document, How Asia Overcame the First Polycrisis and Forged a Path Out of Poverty. Because measured at the $2.15 level, the drama of modern history since the 1990s is that poverty in Asia, notably in East Asia, has essentially been extinguished, has been ended. Previously, very poor societies like South Korea, Japan, and of course China on a spectacular scale have ended $2.15. That's $2.15 a day in our money. So there's no ifs and buts. This is a measure of our purchasing power. Slightly different story at the $6.15 mark. I will come around to that. I am, I think, going to lose this headpiece. It's my big head and the collar. I hope it doesn't matter, but we'll see. I'll keep going anyway. But you can see a huge, extraordinary contrast between the world of the early 1970s and the world today. And that, when we talk about Asia rising, I think you can start with the GDP aggregates and the fabulous views of big cities, but I think it behooves us to speak about this story. This is the end of immiseration and absolute poverty for literally billions of people, and that's what's being promised. And that, I think, is the drama that we ought to center on. But I think we also need to recognize complexity, because though it's true that absolute poverty has been ended in East Asia, that's not true for Asia as a whole. And really what we're talking about is Northeast Asia. If you look at the poverty figures for... No, it's just absolutely fallen off. Can you still hear me? Is it okay? It's just going to carry on. If we look at poverty at the $3.65 mark, and obviously shifting these around, it's a statistician's game. They allow each one of these snapshots allows us to see something else. But if we take this very modest level of poverty measurement as $3.65, then what we see is that though poverty has indeed been abolished in East Asia, it's still very much a reality in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And that's what I really want to, as it were, stress in some of the comments that follow. This isn't in any way to deny that India has made gigantic progress. The story of the Indian middle class that excites so many people, both in India and outside, is absolutely real. But it's one that's dogged to an even greater extent than its equivalent story in China by the problem of inequality. And by the persistence in India, as you can see here, post-COVID, we think 134 million Indians living on $2.15. Absolute poverty, the very bottom of the scale. And then on the one mark just above that, a huge mass, close on 1 billion Indian people, families living on the edge of something that you might describe as tolerable middle income. And the question in India is whether or not an acceleration beyond that mark is possible. Setting aside questions of growth rates, this is the question, right? If you can move a society from a state of dire poverty, of absolute shortage of food and housing, to one in which people are living tolerably acceptable standards, their kids are getting basic education. And I think this is the central question which haunts this optimistic sense that Asia is rising, and by that we mean finally escaping the reality that Asia's history more than ever confirmed that poverty will forever be with us. Right? That's the world historic significance of what we're talking about here, the escape from the reality that humans' destiny was shaped in a fundamental way by poverty. China has given an answer to that. The question, I think, is whether the rest of Asia can follow. And if you speak to optimistic Indians about this, they'll tell you some story like this, right? They'll tell you quite reasonably that India's electronic governance is more sophisticated than the vast majority of European countries. They can ping money to people. Even illiterate elderly ladies in far-off villages with minimal electricity supply can be provided with doles of money by the Indian government electronically to not terribly smart phones that everyone can understand and everyone can afford. And it's a remarkable achievement. Nothing I'm going to say should detract from that in any way. But there are two different ways of looking at this, I think. One is the official government's view, which is that this is the basis and it's one of the great achievements. It's called the stack. They picked up some really highfalutin language from tech science and have applied this. The national Indian stack is this extraordinary achievement of the genius of Indian software engineers, which of course now populates Silicon Valley, applied to basic problems of governance in what is still a low middle income country. And so one story they tell here is a massive ecosystem of flourishing technological innovation and the basis for growth. If you listen to other sorts of Indians, they'll tell you that there's a much grimmer possibility here, which is that this is a basic stabilization device that enables a radically unequal society to maintain basic standards of living for the indefinite future, whilst the fundamental problems of state building, which were deferred in India decade after decade, are not addressed because they don't have to be, because the technology will do the trick and will get the money and the resources to people that need to get it, that need it. So one is a onwards and upwards, a move by way of Shenzhen to Silicon Valley, and the other one is a low middle income trap, enabled by technology. And the people I learned that lesson from, or gave that alternative narrative from, were CPR, and some of you in the May room may know what happened to the CPR think tank in New Delhi in the last 12 months. It was shut down because that's not a message that the Modi government wants to hear. So these issues of discussing the future of a technological triumph by any measure are hugely controversial in what we rightly celebrate as the world's, I think, greatest democracy, the world's largest democracy. And that's just the beginning of the complexity of the South Asian story, because I referred to Bangladesh a minute ago, and after all, we have witnessed a bona fide, outright, flat-out revolution before our eyes. It hasn't attracted much attention because we've been focused on the Middle East and Ukraine and the Trump election. 170 million convulsed by a revolution which is upending basic compromises about secularism and the position of the dominant Islamic majority in Bangladesh at this moment. Hugely controversial. You move across to the other side, what used to be, what is Pakistan, and you have what is, by everyone's admission, basically one of the most fragile political economies in the world today. Pakistan is a country, I'm going to use population as my basic index here, so keep count and keep counting because it's a big number we're going to end up to, of 242 million people who between them last summer had about $3 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Now you cannot cope at that kind of level of foreign exchange reserve for any period of time. This is a huge country, larger than any country and massively larger than any country in Europe, on the edge of viability, and one whose government now has unleashed a huge military campaign to address the issue of what they, of course, designate as terrorism and what, more importantly, perhaps their Chinese investors have designated as terrorism in some of the most ungovernable places on the planet. And then there's Sri Lanka, which in 2022 exploded into a flat-out, classic, textbook case of polycrisis, complete breakdown of the political system, the social structure, and the economy before our eyes. You could say this is all very long way away from all of us. This needn't worry us until, of course, you're in Canada, or for that matter in New York, or for that matter reading the South China Morning Post, where you have a now very conformist Hong Kong newspaper exploiting, Disney cartoon levels of Oriental contempt to point out that the Canadian government is essentially at loggerheads and have dismissed the diplomats of India over what the Canadian judicial authorities and those in New York as well claim is a systematic campaign by the Indian government to kill opposition politicians in exile in North America. So this is not a calm scene of resolved issues. And if you go, of course, further to the east from there, if the computer will let me, we actually have a full-blown state collapse in Myanmar, affecting 55 million people. And again, in that case, opening up fundamental questions of state building that were never resolved from the 1940s onwards in the aftermath of the collapse of the British Empire, the retreat of the British Empire and the Cold War. And to the east from there, Thailand, which in many cases is thought of as a sort of haven of calm, but if you ask political scientists, is a textbook case of a vicious cycle of a profoundly conservative, entrenched, deeply, truly reactionary elite, which since the 1930s, by way of the Thai military, has been resisting the repeated vote of the Thai population for change. Again and again and again, military coups, one after the other, all of which we sort of pass over without, I think, deep comment. If you track the Asian media as best I can through the languages that I can read, there are extraordinarily complex spillover effects from Thailand, for instance, to Laos, which is itself a society facing profound and unresolved questions of politics, which in 2023 intersected, like in Pakistan, with a massive financial crisis. You could be perhaps excused for not focusing on Laos's financial crisis or the spillover effects from Thai politics to Laos, perhaps not in this company, but in general in the world you might be, because it's such a small place, it's 8 million people. But right next door is Vietnam, and Vietnam, as anyone who knows who does the think tank circuit in the Asia decoupling story right now, is everyone's happy idea of the Asian society that's going to benefit most from American decoupling from China, except what do any of us outside understand about Vietnamese politics, which has been churning through the Communist Party elite at an extraordinary pace in the last 2 to 3 years, in a story about a increasingly authoritarian security service-led regime, which, as far as I can see, intersects in no meaningful way with the stories that we tell about the decentralization of supply chains and microchip factories and smartphones. There seems to me a really profound cognitive disconnect, which is enabled by the simplifications that we offer of the Modi story, the China story, and deglobalization. And what I'm pleading for, because when you tot this up, it's 650 million people that we're talking about. 650 million people and several really large, systemically important and dynamic polities. We need to be smarter about this. Right? By which I mean folks in the West that don't want to be blindsided. We need to be smarter. We need to recognize that history hasn't ended, right? History, at the most basic level of Fukuyama-type questions, how you well order a polity, whether you have rule of law in a conventional sense, whether you have freedom of the press, is extraordinarily open-ended right now in large parts of Asia, without it really, I think, being recognized as a systemic and comprehensive crisis running across many, many countries. And all of that is true at the same time as the force of what many of us think of as the fundamental transformative vector of modern history threatens and faces this continent or these huge spaces like nowhere else on the planet. So this is also from the World Bank report from a few weeks ago. And the point they're making, I think you can see quite clearly, is that there are three really large groups of people really seriously in the crosshairs of climate change. And the most vulnerable, by far, are sub-Saharan Africa, where the climate impacts are already manifest and are going to hit really hard. And they have very, very little domestic resource to cope. And East Asia is going to be affected very seriously, but as the difference between the blue and the red circle suggests, East Asia has massively more resilience because it's so rich and so technologically sophisticated. But in between, ladies and gentlemen, is South Asia and Southeast Asia, which is in the crosshairs of climate change and is very much at that level of low income that puts you in a seriously hard place. Now, Bangladesh has demonstrated by the extraordinary virtuosity of its weather forecasting and flood warning system how you can save lives even with minimal means. But the question we have to ask ourselves, given what we've already seen, is whether that kind of improvised response is going to be enough. And what I'm thinking of is Pakistan again. I mean, these things are happening so fast on such a large scale that we forget that in August 2022, roughly a third of Pakistan was inundated in a gigantic flood. To translate this into rather trivial European terms, it's as though a country the size of Croatia or larger than Denmark or the Netherlands was inundated in a matter of weeks. It is frankly a miracle that more people didn't die. But this is the beginning of the mega crises in the same way as the huge Indian heat wave. It's already here. It's not something in the future. It's already here. It's already stressing these societies in the way that we have long predicted it will. And it's not for nothing that the problem of global climate justice was in fact first formulated in Asia, and specifically by India. If you go back to the beginnings of global climate policy in the late 80s and the early 1990s, if you go back to Rio, if you go back to the first COPs, it was Indian academics who put the issue of climate budget and carbon budget on the agenda first, because their country, as they fully understand, is one that's, as it were, it's the opposite of the sweet spot. They are massively impacted by climate change. They are, relatively speaking, minimally responsible for it. And if we're serious about climate politics going forward, their developmental prospects will be most inhibited by the necessary decarbonization measures. And Indian academics did the math on this, as you'd expect, and came rather rapidly to the conclusion that this was a bum deal. What's astonishing, and of course this was originally formulated, as I suggested here, as a north on south problem. And this should be credited with the force that it's had in defining the polycrisis right now. The climate crisis is the most encompassing risk that many of us think about. And this was coded from the very beginning by Asian actors, by Asian intellectuals, by Asian policy as a north-south problem, and it was centered on India. The historic irony is that this argument was made precisely at the moment. Now what's happening? I don't want to abbrechen, that's for certain. This diagnosis was made in the early 1990s, precisely at the moment when Asian emissions overtook those of the West. And this, for me, is one of the most awesome graphs in world history. Now, to be clear, this is not an apologist graph. This doesn't, of course, deal with accumulated emissions over time, and it's the ones that are already up in the atmosphere that matter for climate change. And the Europeans and the Americans pumped that out over decades, and they accumulated dramatically. But in terms of policy choices going forward, this is the graph that matters. Because we can't do much until we do carbon capture. We can't do much about old emissions. But what we can do is change the emissions track going forward. And what happened in the late 80s and early 1990s is a spectacular shift. This is for real. So this is the Indo-Pacific CO2 emissions curve, and there's the United States, and there it's Europe underneath. This is an extraordinary gear shift in the center of global production. This is the environmental counterpart to the fact that industrialism and manufacturing are centered in East Asia in the way that one of my earlier graphs showed. Specifically, of course, it's a China story. China's surge into heavy industrialism from the late 1990s onwards, pre-planned by Communist Party decision-making in the 1980s to double and then double and then double again coal output to turn China into the greatest coal producer in the world, and then by far the greatest coal producer humanity has ever witnessed, produces this outcome. I mean, this is a truly, one has to linger over this, because this is all of world economic history, right? As far as we know it, back to the middle of the 18th century. Using a single variable, what it's telling you is that the explosion of Chinese production in our lifetimes, as recently as the last 25 years, dwarfs everything else in the annals of human economic history, and significantly dwarfs, doesn't just modestly overtake, but blows it to dimensions the world has never seen before. This is the CO2 counterpart to the Chinese producing more steel than the entire world put together. It's the counterpart to the fact that China, in 3 years, between 2010 and 2013, poured more concrete than the United States in the 20th century. In 3 years. Right? This is not the Industrial Revolution done again. Everything prior to this was a prelude to the Chinese Industrial Revolution of our lifetimes. Literally everyone in this room lived the whole thing. It's all happened in the last 25 years. The surge in Chinese energy consumption between 2000 and 2005 is the total break with all previous experience. And the consequence of that is that the climate crisis now and going forward is an Asian-on-Asian crisis. Essentially, to put it really crudely, and this has actually happened in climate talks, it's about Chinese emissions drowning Pacific Islands. That's the dynamic that's currently driving it. The Americans can do whatever they damn well like, and they clearly should. But the forcing pace of this transformation is coming from Asia. And so one of the upshots of this is it's a kind of de-stress about the American elections, because the American elections really matter to global climate politics. But the thing we should all really be focusing on is a decision being taken behind closed doors in Beijing right now, which is China's nationally determined contribution to its Paris objectives, which it has to announce by February. And that matters because that's China's energy transition path, and that's the energy transition path of the Europeans and the United States. The huffing and puffing that we've been doing in recent years, as you can see here, is trivial by comparison with the hairpin bend that the Chinese have to accomplish in coming years. So that decision being taken behind closed doors in Beijing right now is the one that really decides the parameters for everyone's decarbonization effort going forward. That is the crucial choice, and it's quite opaque. The bureaucrats there are top-notch energy and climate scientists, but we really have minimal insight into what's going on. And this, to me, has Welthistorisch, world historic significance. Why? Because the climate problem, I think it's fair to say, after the waning of the enthusiasm of socialism and Marxism as a vision of progress, progressive and specifically left-wing politics in the West defined the climate crisis as the acid test of rationality. This was where rationality was going to be assessed. And the question now is, what is the answer that Beijing is going to give, given the profoundly disappointing way in which the West has answered to date? And we ask that question today under the shadow of the loss of legitimacy that Beijing has suffered in recent years. And I want to end by a few snapshots in thinking about that and the challenges that it poses. Because it's clear that the nimbus of omnipotence, omnicompetence that Beijing for a long time enjoyed has been stressed, indeed, some would say shattered. Now, one aspect of that is the ending, the very deliberate ending by the Chinese regime of the what we sometimes euphemistically call the housing bubble, but what in fact is the largest urbanization drive in the history of our species, bar none. Over a period of 25 years, 500 million people were moved from the countryside into the city, and people within the cities moved. We've never seen anything like it. The Earth moved somewhat on its axis as a result. The Earth actually is slightly pushed off. Not astrologers, astronomers tell us. And Beijing was profoundly successful at this. The question is whether it still, in general, commands the authority to make the moves that are necessary. And I don't think there's any doubt that apart from the economic shock of the slowdown, the other big variable that needs to be on all our minds is the long-run impact of the pandemic and the way the pandemic was handled. And there can be very few more telling graphs than this. It's kind of amazing that the Chinese allow this to be published, but this to me is a barometer of confidence, not just amongst consumers, but amongst China's population in general. This is the barometer of consumer confidence in China, and you can see the story here. It collapses, and it collapses as a result, clearly, of the COVID shock. But this is where I want to sort of probe and do the kind of Asia society political analysis thing, and this, I promise, is the final point that I want to make. How do we read this? The prevalent interpretation on part of many people in the West is that this demonstrates the disaster of what could not but be an authoritarian, repressive response to COVID, because Xi Jinping doesn't know any different, and this is how the regime works. And so, of course, it was just a matter of time until they screwed up, and then the house of cards has come down. The problem for me in that interpretation is it captures only one or two dimensions of this graph. It captures the fact that the line goes down from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. It doesn't tell us anything very interesting about the timing, but look at the timing for a second. When does confidence in the Chinese situation break? Does it break at the beginning of the epidemic? No, it breaks in 2022. For the most of the pandemic, if you look at this graph for Germany, it breaks in the spring of 2020 for good reason. Same for the US. In China, it doesn't break until the spring of 2022. That's because for the first phase of the pandemic, China was winning and knew it was winning. And the consequence of that is they were partying in Wuhan in the summer of 2020. And the real crisis comes in the spring of 2022, when in a fit of hubristic technocratic optimism, they thought they would perfect dynamic optimization, which was their code word for the way in which they tried to manage the pandemic, and they applied it to Shanghai, of all cities. And the Shanghai bourgeoisie found themselves with empty refrigerators, and you know how well that's going to go in Chinese public opinion. Not the kind of bitterness that folks were up for eating at that particular moment. So my counter-thesis is that this precise issue of timing matters because it's a case in point of our blindness to the complexity and sophistication of Asian political stories. We so easily apply the bludgeon of simply saying it's authoritarian regime and authoritarian regimes can't do this, whilst in fact refusing to acknowledge that for most of the time they were ahead of the game. And the pandemic they faced in 2022 was as bad and uncontrollable as it was. Why? Because we'd failed to control it here. So it had mutated and produced several strains which weren't amenable to Chinese solutions. And if you start there, then a whole variety of other things about the Chinese regime since 2020 become more explicable, because in the summer of 2020, they do three things beyond managing. Having won the people's war against COVID, what do? They crack down on the tech oligarchs, they crack down on the opposition in Hong Kong, and they launched the Red Lines policy that ends the housing boom. To my mind, it's an effect of a kind of self-conscious radicalization. And why is this more than an antiquarian point? This is a historian's mind at work, you can see. Why does this matter? Because what else came out of that phase where we just weren't looking and weren't paying attention and were convinced the Chinese were just locked down when they weren't, is the second China shock. If you want to know where the electric vehicle boom happened that has destroyed the self-confidence of German manufacturing right now, it's precisely in these years when Chinese consumers were not locked down. They were going out to buy a new generation of vehicles provided by BYD, which Western producers were completely oblivious to because we were the people, not in a lockdown, but in a COVID funk that meant we weren't able to focus on what was actually going on. We had COVID brain, not them. This is the lesson. So let me just conclude in what has been an overlong talk. Let me just conclude with some general points. The first is that Asia is in the age of polycrisis, right? We're not going to buy that narrative by which it's somehow exempt. It's both the greatest generator of change and the greatest generator of solutions, and it needs to be, not just because it's got the power and the capacity, but because it's so stressed. It's not a huge region of the world in which the solutions have all been found. And the stakes are incredibly high because despite the success in the abolition of poverty, there are still hundreds of millions of people who are extremely vulnerable. Extremely vulnerable. What are the general lessons for us outside Asia? It seems to me that we have work to do. if we don't want to be blindsided, if we actually want to live in this world that we constantly proclaim we're part of as part of globalization, then we first of all have to understand and come to terms with Asia's agency. We have to understand the relativization of our own position. We have to understand the climate drama is no longer about us, not as the goodies and not even as the baddies, right? You're not, by solving the Exxon problem, going to solve the global climate crisis anymore. You have to fix China coal, which is a much, much more serious problem and can only be done by Beijing. We have to understand massive regional diversity and not allow ourselves to be seduced by simple stories about one or two countries. And we have to track events as they happen in real time, as history, not as a series of sort of potted narratives, but as something that urgently concerns all of us. We're all constantly in the Wuhan moment. Remember Wuhan? Somebody managed to convince themselves that Wuhan was Chernobyl. Suck on that for a second. Wuhan, a city of 10 million people compared to an outback nuclear reactor dorp in some long-forgotten part of the Soviet Union. How deep can your misunderstanding be of the nature of Chinese urbanization and its consequences? Right? We are all continuously living under that kind of pressure. And that's why it's such a delight to be at the Asia Society, because that's what you do. That's exactly what I see your manifesto as being, and it's a real privilege to be part of this conversation. I look forward very much to continuing it this evening and tomorrow. Thank you.
Getting you a microphone that can't fall off.
Just fall off my big head, yeah.
You just fall out of your hand. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. It was wide-ranging. I always feel a little bit bad when I ask people to deliver the State of Asia address, because literally the entirety of the instructions we give people is like, we'd like you to talk about the state of Asia. And then they ask anything in specific. We say, no, just whatever you want. And I think you rose to the occasion marvelously, and thank you very much for that. Before we jump into the conversation, we did say that we also wanted to take your question, and we do. We have so many people here tonight that we decided it would be easier if you submitted those questions in writing, so that I can censor them appropriately on my iPad here and then put them to Adam in the correct order that I will determine. So you can scan that code and submit them, and we'll get to them in a minute. So Adam, it's kind of hard to try to start somewhere, but in a way, you brought out this narrative where at first you seemed to say that Asia was actually not in a polycrisis, but of course they are, because I guess there's always a polycrisis somewhere. And it seemed to me that maybe does this all come down to a feeling, to optimism. For whatever reason, even though you laid out all the problems and you laid out the polycrisis that it happens not just here but in Asia, but for a reason that I can't really put my finger on precisely, they don't seem to feel, again, the broad generalization, but sort of the feeling we're getting, the statements we're hearing from at least some of the larger Asian countries, that they don't think they're in a polycrisis, even though they obviously are. Can you explain what the difference is in sort of just levels of optimism here?
Yeah, I'm sorry this talk wasn't straightforward that way. I prefer that kind of movement of tension at the risk of self-contradiction. So yeah, that is a tension that's really at the center of this talk. And yes, I started with the sort of check your own prejudices move of going, maybe this is really just a kind of Western, and specifically a Western elite freak out, right? So I don't disagree with that move. And clearly when you take this to Asia, often you have this, you go to somewhere like Singapore, and it's pretty difficult to feel that you're in a world of polycrisis in Singapore. So I feel that. So it could be the polycrisis is really localized. If you go and talk about it in South Africa, they'll say, thank God you've finally woken up and realized, they never exit the 1970s, right? If you look at Africa's industrial and economic growth, it slows down to a grinding, nightmarish halt in the 70s. The poverty that's still visible in the World Bank data is 50 years old in that sense, the relative sense. But I appreciate your move to the emotional or the psychological, because I think there's two different levels at which I'd want to address that. The first is that I think it's a legitimate level at which to address this problem. I mean, sometimes people will say, don't you think polycrisis talk is just, stressed middle-class people in the West, like making lives too complicated for themselves? But I'm the sort of person that takes the global mental health crisis seriously. And I think actually we do face a global mental health crisis. It's quite actually easy to measure. It shows up in macroeconomic aggregates. The more we look for it, the more we find it, and it's really quite dramatic. And so I would take that on the chin and say, yes, it's emotional, I think. I would then immediately insist that Asia cannot in any way be exempted from this. I think especially the richer parts of Asia are fully part of that same mood. And thinking of China, the way it expresses itself there and is all these buzzwords, right, of involution, of lying flat, of the sense of never being able to escape the treadmill, of this weird complex of factors that expresses itself in the demands of the job, the career that has to terminate, somewhere in your 30s or your 50s, depending on whether you're a man or a woman, the difficulty of raising children, satisfying the expectations of your parents, the extraordinary cost of housing, so on and so forth. This is recognizable, I think, as a fully modern crisis that we really should resist any kind of sense of saying, well, these people are more phlegmatic, they're used to work. I think the regime invokes this image of the Chinese as tough, as, willing to take. But I don't know how sustainable it is, and I think it's also a kind of progressive moving frontier. But then again, in the spirit of like this back and forth. So I think we should take the global mental health crisis seriously as an expression of polycrisis, and we should resist any idea of thinking it's merely Western. I think we need to think of it as comprehensive. If you look at the WHO data on mental illness, it's important to say, it's on the blindingly obvious, but the heaviest concentration of depression is in Africa. And I find that on the one hand horrifying, and on the other hand confirming, because that's what you'd expect. Life is toughest and hardest there, and people's expectations of the future are grimmest there, and African countries have some of the highest suicide rates in the world. And so, you see what I mean? Like, mental health is not a privilege of the rich world that other parts of the world are exempt from. It's in fact an endemic and huge problem. And then I would spin this the other way and say, as a Keynesian economist, there is something about that you're getting at that's very, very real, which is that ultimately investment, because investment is hinged on the very long-distant future if you're building anything big. And we really have no way of knowing what the long-distant future is going to be like, despite all our forecasting efforts. It depends on projection. And Keynes described that projection as animal spirits. And if you were to say the difference between the West and Asia is that their mojo is going and they have animal spirits in their investment function, and the West doesn't, I think it would be really easy to find macroeconomic data that immediately supported that.
Yeah.
And one of the consequences of that, when you break it down at the supply side level, is what you hear again and again about European and American businesses as they operate in China. They'll say things like, it's so easy to get things done here. If I say I want this, 48 hours later, some company comes back with a better thing than I gave them. And I think that's, if you like, the material reality behind a higher level of growth, which encourages an outlook which projects that higher level of growth into the future, which builds capacity, encourages investment, creates a culture of radical change, which all sound like silly business sound bites. But I think you can see it translated into, my favorite examples all come from the electricity system, where no one in Europe or the United States has built long-distance transmission lines for electricity on a large scale for decades. Electrification used to be a sexy, dynamic thing in the West too, but it stopped being that in the 70s and stabilized. China has built the world's largest, not just the world's, China's electricity system today has twice the capacity of the US system, and they've built it in 25 years. So do they have cohorts of electrical engineers who are ready to go for bigger and bigger and bigger projects in China or the rest of the world? Of course they do. It's almost a sociological rather than a psychological condition. You literally have people, teams of people, who know how to stamp high-speed railways out of the ground at extraordinary pace. And so in this space between the psychological, the economic in the form of animal spirits, and the sociological in the form of just masses of engineering talent, there is a reality to what you're saying, I think, that Asia has this dynamism that the rest of the world lacks, and that makes a fundamental difference.
Yeah. And I wonder, I'm going to stay on the sort of broad topic of emotions, also as a way to avoid all the Trump questions you guys want to ask for a little bit longer.
Trump doesn't cause any emotional reaction on your part?
It probably does. So I wonder if this optimism is also somewhat correlated with the agency and autonomy that you mentioned, and that would lead me to the question: well, what does it mean for us? Because you said, sort of, what we need to do if you really want to be serious about, achieving the green energy transition, if we want to be serious about addressing climate change, the thing we need to fix is Chinese consumption of coal. Now, from a Western perspective, from a European perspective, I think there's kind of two reactions. This one is to sort of, basically, it's defeatism, say, like, we can't do anything, right? This is beyond us. We don't even understand how these decisions are made, much less are we able to influence them. And then sort of the related cousin would be carelessness. So like, well, it's not our problem anymore. We caused it, but it's officially out of our hands. Thank you very much, Adam Tooze. We can now just go on and burn all the fossil fuel we want, because we know at the end of the day, that whatever we do doesn't matter. I'm assuming those are neither. You're going to advocate for neither of those strategies. But so how do we, it feels like it's very hard for a region or a continent, a society that's used to be in the driver's seat to accept to not be anymore. How do we do this productively? Like, how can we achieve like productivity, maybe not in irrelevance, but sort of in periphery?
It's funny that question is put in Switzerland, because you would have thought that Switzerland's curse of its entire history, it is a lovely place to live, it's just irrelevant. Like, it's lovely, it's just whatever you do here is great, but try translating it to a big, complicated place. This is ridiculous, right? Because obviously Switzerland is small and complicated. But that is the kind of response that you get, and that already contains the answer. Is evidently I'm not saying that, right? What I'm saying is, this is the provincialization of the West, which cultural theorists have been telling us about for decades, and now it's real in the most decisively physical and material way that shapes the future of our planet. And we need to grasp the significance of that. And does that relativize our agency? Absolutely it does. And so then you need smart strategies as medium or small players to punch above your weight in that space, if that's what you aspire to. As Switzerland has done, you become an entrepot. I mean, in the global commodity economy, which is so crucial to this story, Swiss companies play an absolutely pivotal role, right? Both in terms of finance and in terms of logistics. They're the big trading houses. So you have an intermediary function. One of the things I was always preaching to the Biden people, we forget it now, is if they really wanted to do a green Marshall Plan, they should be harnessing Wall Street's financial capacity to enable poor countries to buy Chinese photovoltaics. Right? That would be the suitable partnership. So Europe, I think the EU in various ways, some obvious and some more controversial, has actually been an example of how you react. So you do your own homework, first of all. You're serious about decarbonization. And secondly, you offer assistance, you offer finance, you offer advice, you offer models. And the Chinese have actually taken advantage of this in exactly the way that you would expect from the early 2000s onwards. A lot of Chinese green energy was fostered by collaboration with the Germans, and their carbon pricing system was modeled on that of the ETS, because they're quick, super smart learners, unafraid to learn and then modify and adapt, and they've done that on climate policy. And then the third thing you do is, if you're Europe, is you leverage what leverage you've got, which is your market's attractive, and so then you do carbon pricing, which the Americans don't have the guts to attempt, and then you impose a CBAM. And you ride out the storm that hits you from the global south, saying you're involved in carbon protectionism, and you just calmly say, no, we have a carbon price. We expect everything that's carbon containing in our market to be sold at that carbon price. That's why we're doing the CBAM. If you'd like to talk to us about green industrialization and how you move your steel sector from using primary iron to using scrap, let's talk. But the CBAM becomes a lever. So you model, you facilitate, and you leverage in a space in which you don't. I mean, South Korea is another exemplary case, right? Medium-sized players with a huge amount to offer who don't imagine themselves as driving world history, but think of themselves as making a positive contribution to a collective effort. Once upon a time, I would have embraced Sunnylands and the new model of great power relations. That would have been my kind of, the halcyon days of Xi Jinping and Obama, like mapping out the new terrain. That obviously feels like yesterday's news nowadays. But that would be the space in which this isn't going to be a world dominated by China in the way the Western world was dominated by the US in the 40s or unipolarity in the 90s. That's not our future. So everyone has to absorb and deal with the fact that we're all mutually interdependent and to an extent always, in some senses, comprehensively in just a contributing position. But your point's absolutely valid. Wang Qing, who's sitting here, literally witnessed an American student ask me, well, why should I get out of bed in the morning? Like, if it's true that the future is not determined by the United States, why should I get out of bed in the morning?
I'm gonna turn to some of the audience questions. I will permit myself to de-Trumpify them slightly and give them maybe a somewhat broader scope. The first one, which is to say the most populous one, which got the most upvotes, not unsurprisingly, is on Taiwan. And specifically, there's, again, the word Trump appears here. But the question I want to put to you is maybe a little bit broader. In the context of what you said at the very end of your talk, where I think sort of the two messages that I took away was both sort of the immense state capacity of China to achieve, all of these transitions, to build an EV industry like no other, but also the somewhat worrisome radicalization of policymaking either as a direct result of what's happened during COVID or just that having been as a trigger. And it seems to me the question of Taiwan is sort of where these things collide, right? It's both something that my assumption is a large part of Chinese policymakers really want to achieve, but also something that could fundamentally threaten all the achievements they've already made, as well as the ones they would still have to make. So in the context of your understandings of, I'm not asking for a prediction, I'm asking for sort of how does the system think about a question like this, and how does it deal with this inherent contradiction?
Beijing, the system in Beijing.
Yes.
Hands up, anyone in the room who feels they have a good grip on we have sitting at the front here. I agree that's clearly a fundamental issue, and it's an issue that's fundamental because it has this utterly confounding quality of both being so obviously a legacy of the 1940s. Mm-hmm. And so obviously now carried forward by the autonomous, very substantial, incredible talent and sophistication of Taiwan itself. And so there is it's like a mega version of the Hong Kong problem. And it would be utterly hubristic for somebody like myself to be venturing opinions about it. My main view as somebody who's principally identified with Europe is, and this I feel very strongly about, and it's heavily supported by opinion polling that the European Council of Foreign Relations did, which I'm attached to. I see no possible justification for Europe engaging itself in a strong and heavy-handed way in that conflict. I just don't get it from a historical point of view, from a democratic point of view, from a point of view of self-interest. It's not legitimated by the European public. If you ask the Europeans what position they want, is a position of neutrality. I see no business other than bad legacies of imperialism that cause us to be there. And so that's my vision on this from the European point of view. What it looks like from Beijing's side, I wouldn't want to venture an answer. There are people in this room much better qualified to comment on the inner workings. I think we see two things. One is that there is a build-up of Chinese military capacity, which is very real and very significant. Not at all surprising, because if you have an economy that grows that fast, even if you don't increase the share of military spending, it becomes a huge force, and the Chinese know what to do with it. And it's also, I think, utterly unsurprising that you see a sharpening of ambition and demand and scale on Beijing's part, and specifically perhaps in the figure of Xi Jinping, who does seem to have an understanding of the Chinese, the CCP's project, which is very strongly national. I think there's two things that really stand out about him. One is that nationalism, and the other is actually his commitment to the environmental issue, which is quite distinctive. But for me, it is an instance which just poses this really deep problem, which at one level is a question of intelligence. What do we actually know about what's going on inside? What are our theories which guide our interpretation of that intelligence? And we were talking about it earlier on as somebody who spent a lot of time studying wars and how they break out. Are we even convinced that Beijing itself, and I mean the insiders in Beijing, would necessarily be able to compose an adequate picture of how decision-making like that is being made? I mean, I'm haunted by the extraordinary difficulty in understanding, I think, Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. I understand the motives, they're perfectly obvious to me. But that's not at all the same thing as understanding that moment where you decide, right, this is intolerable, I'm now going to launch a major war. Or even, this is intolerable, I'm going to assume it won't be a major war and then do it. Like, both of those are moves which are qualitatively different. And I think you were saying earlier on, Adam, that sounds almost like a metaphysical question. And I actually think that is the moment when politics takes on a slightly metaphysical aspect, the moment when you launch your state, your society, into a challenge which, as you rightly say, could put everything at stake. What would move you to do that? And it's horrifying, but just an ineradicable part of political history, of great power history, that it has a rational, calculable logic, and there are teams of people trying to do the math on that. And then it also has this irreducible element, which has a rather different quality. And it's difficult, even in systems which are very well documented, to fully construct what's going on there. But a system as poorly documented to the outsiders as the Chinese one, I mean, I think I just want to reiterate this because it hangs over us so heavily, but I find the reporting that Politico did and Kate Ward's book about the Biden administration, about the process that group of people went through to understand that the evidence they saw left no alternative but to conclude that somewhere early in 2022, Russia was going to invade Ukraine. That was an incredibly difficult process they went through internally, mentally, psychologically, intellectually, to wrap their heads around this and to sum up the courage to start going to NATO meetings, to meetings with incredulous, disbelieving Europeans, even with Ukrainians themselves, to say, you understand this is happening, including the most devastating comeback from the Ukrainians, which is, well, if that's true, what do you expect us to do? What on earth what are we supposed to do with this information if it's true? And I think, given that, I feel, given the awesome implications of that at an intellectual level, I feel very shy about offering slapdash, arguments. He's going to do it by X, and I'm really worried about the fact. Just to conclude, sorry, this is such an important topic, and it's really worth driving home. That over the winter of 2022 to 2023, as the Americans got gung-ho about the fact that the war in Ukraine was going well, they also, to my mind, allowed the slide to increasing confrontation to China to become dangerous. And to just reinforce the point I'm making, part of that was deliberate, intentional. Part of that was out of their control because Pelosi's her own thing and she does her thing. Part of that's out of their control because balloons are balloons and they blow around and then Fox News does whatever it likes. But part of that was American soldiers saying, the Zelensky comeback, well, if that's true, what are we going to do? If there is this escalation, what are we going to do? And the answer of the soldiers is we need to prepare for it, for war. And we need to steel ourselves to the reality of it coming. And that one email that slipped out that was widely reported around the world of a relatively mid-ranking American general saying to his logistics teams in the Asia-Pacific region, you need to be ready for war by 2025, was not a freakish thing. An extremely highly placed, well-sourced journalist friends of mine in DC was speaking to the very highest levels of the American command chain in the spring of 2023 about their expectation that war was going to happen in 2025. And that, ladies and gentlemen, there isn't anything more serious that could possibly be true than that, to my mind, other than an actual war, because that's telling you they are trying to bridge that gap, that existential gap between their day-to-day reality and where they, as professional soldiers, think they might need to be, preemptively. They're steeling their teams, for this is not a drill. And that's so difficult. That's both very difficult to do and terrifying when you do it, because you then you got to jump.
I want to ask probably one last question, but I think this is a really important one that came in about demographics, which you didn't talk about too much. Obviously, we're seeing very low birth rates in China, in Japan, and South Korea. In Asia, I think in China, we might argue that sort of the demographic curve that the country went through was also, in a way, contributing to the decline in poverty that you pointed out. But now I think the demography is mostly seen for these countries as an issue, as an inhibitor to future growth, as an inhibitor to providing solutions and continue to foster. How do you see the topic fit into the narrative? Is the demographic decline a part of the poly crisis that needs addressing, or is it just an inevitable development we need to, but also, or will be able to kind of include in the solution?
So the first thing to say is, again, an appeal to intellectual modesty. And this isn't a cop-out. This is to say the world that we're in is so radically new and exhibiting so many radical features evolving so quickly that I call it polycrisis. Polycrisis for me is not a better social science. Michael Geyer, a great historian friend of mine, said, no, what you're saying, Adam, is we have a cognitive crisis. And I think a world moving into really large-scale demographic decline is a cognitive crisis, because in the history of our species, outside periods of massive pandemic, 17th century world crisis, we've never seen anything like this. Right? We literally never have. All of us have lived in a world of expanding population, and now in certain, notably South Korea, we're seeing this precipitous fall. So the first thing to say is we don't know. We have no prior track record to go on. Don't believe anyone who comes along and says, well, I know what happens in societies as populations decline. Seriously, really, go actually read some history, and don't just read the data, actually try and think about what this means, right? Because the boom in population globally is one of the most, it's a concomitant of economic growth and economic development of a really complex kind. Because on the one hand, it's an unleashing. It starts with a decline in mortality. And then we see this sort of surge in net fertility. And then it becomes an incredibly ambiguous process, which the decline and the containment. And I think it would have three elements. Like one is, and we are living after all in its aftermath, still today, like the dramatic answer to the 1970s polycrisis I was talking about, the Club of Rome report, is that at least some Chinese technocrats read that report and said, you know what we should do is we should be serious about this. And it was part of the argument that was offered in the 80s to double down on the one-child policy, which is, and we're so far removed from it now, the most extraordinary intervention in human biology and human subjectivity any state surely has ever attempted. Regulating menstrual cycles, forced abortions, it's a spectacular intervention. So that's one response. The other response is what, for sake of argument, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but let's call it the liberal feminist response. This is a choice. This is a matter of choice. And what fertility regulation is about is initially, because we don't have technological contraception, couples actually having to talk about sex and fertility choices, and then individual contraception taking over. And so it's freedom, what's actually being articulated there. But surely the haunting thing about the demographic developments of the current moment is in much of East Asia, we have reason to think that it is a gendered version of the psychological story that we started with, which is that women across large parts of the world regard the choices that are open on reproduction. I don't mean this negatively, it's just that when you solve for that equation, what comes out is birth restriction, right? Totally morally and normatively, I don't have in mind a standard number of children that women should have. That would be absurd. What we can observe is hundreds of millions of people, women have to be the key driver of this, choosing under the circumstances to have one child or even no child at all. And I don't think we should label this crisis, because that gives it a pejorative term, and you end up in natalist space almost by default. But it's an incredibly significant development. If you were blind to the reality and the implications of that, you were missing one of the most dramatic developments imaginable. And one would have to ask why you're blind to it, right? And why, who is the we that's saying we need more children for economic growth, as opposed to the hundreds of millions of I's, which are saying, you know what, on balance, maybe I let go of that idea and I don't do that, or the right moment never arrives, or and it's a credible human drama. So I think we're going to need novels, we're going to need art, we're going to need the blues, we're going to need every mode of cultural appropriation available to us. We're going to need a lot of therapy, to speak about this even in a coherent way, and in a way which isn't, oh, we should have more because more growth. Because on the one hand, you could say it's God's gift. Like, it's kind of degrowth by default. Like, it's degrowth in the most fundamental and organic way. And there's, of course, a lot of people that then get up in arms and, like, get worried about the end of the species. Like, we don't have to go there, but we clearly have to recognize the significance of this shift from societies that couldn't sustain population growth to 150 to 200 years of really unprecedented growth to this reversion. And it's all happening in our lifetimes. I mean, South Korea is Dr. Kang, like, your country's experience just simply bends the mind. Yes, but from immiseration in the 1950s, it really struck me. I was going around one of the Korean art galleries, and one of Korea's national artists died of malnutrition-related disease in a camp in 1951. Like, how many national galleries in the modern world can you go to in which a significant artist died in a camp of malnutrition? Like, it wasn't a gulag. It was just simply lack of food for an artist. Like, it's to the world now, where highly sophisticated modern South Koreans are making these choices, which imply this huge demographic break. So it's a hugely important question. I would just push back so hard against ideas of subordinating this to a macroeconomic growth logic that falls so far from doing justice to the complexity of this phenomenon.
Excellent. There are only 50 questions left online to answer. So given the pace we've gone at now, you have to come back for the next decade to answer them all. But for now, we're done with the questions. But before we end, I would like to ask Christian Schwarzenegger of the University of Zurich back here for closing remarks. Adam Tooze, thank you very much for this. Christian, over to you.